Want to control someone? Do this. Never break a person in front of them. Break their ego.
The studio lights burned bright, casting sharp shadows across the polished stage floor. It was supposed to be another predictable town hall. One of those carefully orchestrated evenings where politicians repeated talking points, moderators kept things civil, and the audience clapped at all the right moments. But this night was destined to escape the script. The two figures seated across from one another could not have been more different. On one side sat Victor Harrington, a seasoned national security advisor with decades of government service under his belt. Harrington had built his reputation on a mixture of blunt confidence and loyalty to powerful administrations. For years, cable news had leaned on him as the insider with war stories from secure rooms and global crisis management. His smirk was as practiced as his resume. He had been through hundreds of debates and interviews. On the other side was Elena Marquez, a first-term Congresswoman from Texas. Young, sharp, and with a background as a federal prosecutor. She had quickly earned a reputation in Washington for being relentless in hearings. But in the broader national stage, many still saw her as untested. Harrington certainly did. He had privately dismissed her as a rookie lawyer playing politics. The moderator, veteran journalist Michael Lawson, opened the evening with a measured tone. He welcomed viewers, laid out the ground rules, and then posed the first question. Who should the American people trust most when it comes to safeguarding national security? It was a softball for Harrington. He leaned forward, voice dripping. With authority, national security isn't theory, it's action. It's about being in the room when tough calls are made, not sitting on the sidelines reading documents. With respect, Congresswoman Marquez simply doesn't have the experience to understand what real decision-making looks like when lives are at stake. The audience responded with polite nods, a few claps. The old narrative experience versus youth seemed to be working in Harrington's favor. Marquez sat still, her expression calm. She didn't interrupt. She didn't take the bait. Instead, she waited. When Lawson turned to her, she began softly. Experience does matter, Michael. But experience without accountability is not leadership. And tonight I came prepared too. Show why that distinction matters. With deliberate motion, she pulled out a folder thick, tabbed, and organized. The sound of paper sliding against the table echoed faintly in the microphone. Studio seemed to lean forward as she held up the first page. These, she said, are Inspector General reports documenting how Mr. Harrington repeatedly disregarded security protocols while serving as deputy advisor. Retaliation against staff who reported violations. Deliberate sidestepping of chain of command on classified material. These aren't rumors. These are government records. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps scattered through the audience. A camera zoomed in on Harrington, whose smirk faltered, then stiffened. Congresswoman. With all due respect, Harrington interrupted, his voice suddenly strained. Those are taken out of context. Complex situations reduced to paperwork, they're not taken out of context. Marquez cut in, her tone firm but not raised. They are the public record. And the American people deserve to know if the individuals lecturing them on security are themselves guilty of ignoring the very rules they expect everyone else to follow. The crowd erupted in applause, thunderous, not partisan. Even independents and skeptics in the audience could feel the weight of authenticity. For a brief moment, it wasn't politics. It was truth breaking through performance. Lawson, ever the professional, tried to restore balance. Mr. Harrington, would you like to respond directly to these allegations? The camera caught Harrington adjusting his tie, his breathing shallow. His words stumbled out. These matters were complex. Classified environments require flexibility that outsiders don't always understand. It was a weak dodge. The audience knew it. Social media knew it. Marquez knew it. She leaned forward, delivering the line that would be replayed millions of times before the night was over. National security is indeed complex, which is why it requires something simple and integrity. Without that, experience is just bluster. And the American people can't afford bluster when the stakes are this high. The applause was deafening. Phones lit up across the audience as clips were instantly captured. Some stood clapping as though they had just witnessed a knockout. In the first round of a championship fight, Lawson, hiding his surprise, cut to commercial. But the damage was already done. Harrington's attempt to dismiss his opponent had backfired spectacularly. In a single exchange, the balance of power on that stage had shifted. Backstage, producers whispered furiously into headsets. "This clip is going viral already," one said, staring at a monitor where hashtags were exploding in real time. In the green room, aides scrambled Harrington's team, frantically drafting talking points to spin the moment, while Marquez's staff simply exchanged stunned smiles. They hadn't expected such a clean hit this early in the night. As the cameras cut to wide shot, capturing the buzzing studio, one thing was undeniable. The spark had been lit. This wasn't just another town hall. This was the beginning of a reckoning. When the cameras cut back from commercial break, the atmosphere inside the studio was unrecognizable. What had started as a predictable policy debate now carried the weight of something historic. The audience, still buzzing from Congresswoman Alina Marquez's takedown, leaned forward in their seats with anticipation. Even Lawson, the veteran moderator who had covered countless political battles, could feel the shift. This was no longer Harrington's stage. The second half of the broadcast dragged forward for him like a slow-motion disaster. His responses became clipped, defensive, operated with vague references to classified obligations and context outsiders don't understand. Every time he dodged, the audience reacted with visible skepticism. His decades of rehearsed gravitas suddenly looked like hollow armor. Meanwhile, Marquez grew stronger with each exchange. Her tone was steady, her evidence precise. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, didn't even crack a smile at Harrington's discomfort. Instead, she projected the calm confidence of someone who knew the facts were on her side. It was the difference between playing defense and setting the terms of the entire game. By the time the broadcast wrapped, the contrast could not have been sharper. One man retreating into vague denials, and one woman rising with clarity and substance. But the true explosion happened outside the studio. The media frenzied within minutes of the town hall's conclusion. The first headlines appeared online: Congresswoman Marquez stuns national security veteran. With receipts on live TV, Washington Post integrity versus experience. Harrington falters in fiery confrontation, Politico prepared and unstoppable. Alina Marquez delivers viral moment, CNN Evan Networks. Traditionally sympathetic to Harrington, couldn't completely ignore the drama. Fox News ran with Harrington ambushed with selective documents and CNN appearance. The framing was defensive. The acknowledgement was unavoidable. Something had happened that would echo across the political landscape, behind newsroom doors. Editors barked orders at junior staff. Clip that exchange. Get it on TikTok, YouTube, Shorts, Instagram Reels, now. Digital desks scrambled to push out versions optimized for every platform, each one carrying the same electrifying clip. Marquez pulling out her folder. The crowd gasping, Harrington visibly rattled. The viral wildfire by midnight. The clip had surpassed 5 million views online. By sunrise, it was everywhere. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Marquez receipts. Hashtag Harrington exposed. Hashtag integrity matters. Memes surfaced at light speed. One popular image showed Harrington sweating under the caption, "When you realize the rookie brought homework." Another simply displayed Marquez holding the folder with the words, "Check the documents." Late-night comedians wasted no time. That very night, a well-known host joked, Victor Harrington thought he was at a debate. Turns out, he was at a surprise audit. The audience roared. But beyond comedy, something deeper resonated. Workers, students, and ordinary citizens across the country began referencing the moment in their own lives. At offices, people said, "Don't pull a Harrington, come prepared." In classrooms, teachers invoked Marquez's folder as an example of research beating rhetoric. On social media, motivational posts spread. Bring your receipts, always. What had begun as a political clash was rapidly evolving into cultural shorthand, the political earthquake inside Washington. The shock waves were immediate. Democratic strategists, who had once considered Marquez a promising but relatively low-profile lawmaker, suddenly saw her as a rising star. Overnight, she had achieved what most politicians struggle to do in years. She had created a viral moment that cut across partisan lines. Emails flew among party operatives. "We need Marquez to headline the fundraiser next month. Put her on the Sunday shows. She's ready. Get her face on the cover of the next campaign ad." Meanwhile, Republican circles were in panic mode. Harrington, long considered one of their go-to voices on national security, had stumbled in spectacular fashion. Text chains among GOP staffers buzzed, who prepped him for that disaster. "This clip is going to haunt us for weeks. We need to get ahead of this narrative fast. Even Harrington's allies began to distance themselves. One conservative commentator, usually quick to defend him, sighed on air, "Look, Victor should have been better prepared. The knives once hidden were now out." Behind closed doors, in her hotel room that night, Alina Marquez's phone lit up relentlessly. Congratulatory texts poured in from colleagues, mentors, and even celebrities. Her Twitter following skyrocketed, 200,000 new followers. In a single evening, her staff, exhausted but exhilarated, huddled together watching the numbers climb like stock tickers. One text stood out among the rest. It was from the Democratic House leadership. "Impressive work tonight. Let's discuss committee assignments." When you're back in D.C., for a freshman Congresswoman, that was no small message. It was the kind of invitation that signaled a career trajectory shifting upward, fast. Meanwhile, across town, Harrington sat with his aides in silence. The room was heavy, the air thick with blame and regret. His phone buzzed too, but the messages were different. "What happened out there? This is bad. Need to do damage control immediately. We stay off TV until we figure this out." Harrington, usually brimming with confidence, looked older than his years as he muttered, "It was supposed to be easy." His team exchanged worried glances. They knew recovery from a moment like this wasn't just about a clever press release. This was a scar. The cultural memento a week later, the confrontation had fully entered the American lexicon. Bringing receipts wasn't just political slang, it had become a phrase for life itself. On TikTok, creators used the audio of Marquez's line. It requires something simple, integrity, overlaying it on clips of everyday people calling out dishonesty. Merch sellers jumped in, releasing t-shirts, mugs, and posters emblazoned with phrases like, "Check the documents and bring your Marquez energy." The story had transcended politics. It had become a parable. Substance over style, preparation over arrogance, truth over bluster. And yet, beneath the memes and headlines, something more profound was happening. Americans disillusioned after years of divisive shouting matches were reminded that political discourse didn't have to be pure theater, that facts, when presented clearly and confidently, could still cut through the noise. For Marquez, this was the beginning of a meteoric rise. For Harrington, it was the start of a long, painful decline. But for America, it was something more. A reminder that the truth, when armed with evidence, could still command the stage. The shockwave of one folder had rewritten the script of both careers and, in some ways, of American politics itself. The morning after the broadcast, Washington woke to a political landscape that felt subtly, yet undeniably altered. Newspapers still ran their pre-scheduled front-page stories about legislation, international developments, and economic forecasts, but every opinion page, every cable chyron, and every talk radio segment returned to the same flashpoint, the confrontation. Between Victor Harrington and Sofia Marquez, for years, Harrington had been a fixture of the national security establishment. His voice, deep and commanding, had graced countless cable segments. His opinions, quoted endlessly in articles, carried the weight of authority. He wasn't just a commentator, he was the commentator for conservative audiences seeking reassurance. That experience could always outshine youthful challenge. But now his name appeared in headlines that carried a sharp edge. Harrington stumbles in primetime clash with freshman Congresswoman. Washington Post. Marquez dominates security debate. Backed by unreleased records. Politico conservative. Pundit caught flat-footed on live television. Reuters. Even the New York Times, often cautious in its phrasing, described the exchange as a watershed moment in televised political accountability. Harrington, reading these headlines over his morning coffee, felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He was not a man accustomed to humiliation, certainly not on national television. The documents Marquez had wielded weren't revelations, at least not to him. They were technical disputes, administrative matters from his tenure that, in his eyes, had long since been settled. Yet in her hands, they had been transformed into weapons. He called his closest aides to his home that morning, summoning them into his leather-bound study where shelves of military history loomed overhead. The message was clear. Damage control was the order of the day. "We hit back immediately," Harrington said, pacing as he spoke. "Op-eds, interviews, sympathetic podcasts. We frame this as a political ambush," she cherry-picked. She manipulated context. "We get ahead of the narrative." His staff nodded, scribbling notes. But even among the loyal there was hesitation. They'd all watched the footage, the way the audience leaned toward Marquez, the way Harrington's confident smirk had faltered under the weight of her evidence. It wasn't just what she said. Was the moment a crystallization of authenticity versus defensiveness that no memo or op-ed could undo? Meanwhile, Marquez was experiencing a very different morning. Her phone buzzed endlessly with messages. Congratulations from colleagues, unexpected praise from seasoned legislators, and even cautious admiration from political opponents who privately respected preparation when they saw it. Her social media following had exploded overnight. Campaign donations were flooding in through her website at a rate her staff could barely keep up with. By noon, hashtags like #MarquezReceipts and #CheckTheDocuments were still trending. Clips of her calmly holding up those reports had been remixed into TikTok audios, set to triumphant music, or shared with captions like "when you actually do your homework for once." The virality extended beyond political circles. Comedians on late-night shows couldn't resist the material. Victor Harrington learned the hard way. One host joked to laughter, "Never pick a fight with someone carrying a folder." But perhaps the most telling sign of the confrontation's reach came from ordinary workplaces and classrooms across the country. A manager prepping for a board presentation sent an all-staff email. "Let's bring our Marquez energy today." A teacher in Ohio tweeted about her students referencing the exchange during a debate assignment. "Don't Harrington this? Bring receipts." For Marquez, the momentum was undeniable. But with momentum came pressure. Senior Democratic strategists quickly recognized her as a rising star. Calls poured in. Would she headline a fundraiser? Could she meet with donors in New York? Would she consider a leadership track within the caucus? Her communications director, a seasoned political hand, cautioned her. This moment is huge, but it's also fragile. They'll try to pigeonhole you as just the receipts lady. We need to broaden your image, show that you're more than this viral clash. Marquez nodded. She understood instinctively what many rookies might not. Viral fame could be a double sword. It was intoxicating, yes, but it could also reduce a career to a meme if not carefully managed. Harrington, on the other hand, was fighting to stay afloat. Conservative media outlets, once eager to feature him, began to hedge. Bookers who had filled his calendar weeks in advance suddenly canceled. One producer, caught on a hot mic, muttered, "He's damaged goods right now." Behind closed doors, Republican strategists seethed at the mishap. Who let him go out there without prep? One operative demanded in a group chat that later leaked. This will haunt us for months. But Harrington wasn't one to retreat quietly. He embarked on a counteroffensive, appearing unsympathetic. Podcasts where hosts allowed him to paint Marquez as manipulative, framing the documents as bureaucratic noise. He penned op-eds about the dangers of partisan ambushes in national security debates. He leaned heavily on his service record, reminding audiences of his decades in government. And yet the sting remained. Every time he appeared, social media was quick to flood his mentions with clips of the confrontation. The internet, relentless as ever, refused to let the story die. 3 weeks later, a particularly brutal meme circulated widely, a split screen of Harrington confidently walking on stage at the CNN town hall, juxtaposed with him slumped in his chair, captioned, "How it started versus how it ended." Even conservative commentators, some of them longtime allies, privately admitted the damage was real. In contrast, Marquez was invited to speak on Sunday's shows where the tone was reverent, even curious. "Congresswoman, how did you prepare for it?" "That moment?" one host asked. She answered plainly, "By doing my job." Oversight isn't about theatrics, it's about facts. The clarity of that message resonated. In an age of spin and spectacle, the sight of a politician wielding evidence rather than sound bites had cut through the noise. But behind the admiration, some cautioned her rise. A veteran lawmaker pulled her aside in the House chamber. "Joy, this moment," he said quietly, "but remember, Washington builds you up to tear you down. They'll be gunning for you now." He wasn't wrong. Opposition research teams had already begun digging through her past cases as a prosecutor, her financial disclosures, even her college writings. If Marquez was to be the new face of preparation and accountability, her enemies would be relentless. In seeking any crack in the facade, still, for now, the aftershocks of that night remained clear. One man's reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, had been shaken. One woman's national profile had been catapulted years ahead of schedule. And a nation weary of empty posturing had witnessed something rare: the triumph of preparation over performance. Of his fumbled answers, he had become unwillingly a teaching tool. The man who had once lectured about security threats now lived as a parable of a different, its kind of vulnerability, the risk of being exposed, unprepared, in front of millions. Marquez's transformation for Sofia Marquez. The transformation was profound. She was no longer simply a first-term Congresswoman with potential. She was a household name. Her approval ratings remained high, her fundraising unmatched by colleagues of her tenure. But what set her apart was how she chose to use her platform. Rather than leaning into celebrity, she doubled down on the work. She pursued bipartisan legislation on oversight reforms, championed voting rights bills, and positioned herself as a watchdog against executive overreach. Her committee assignments reflected this trajectory. Once relegated to minor roles, she now found herself on powerful panels with jurisdiction over intelligence and national security. The very arenas where Harrington once claimed expertise. In a twist that Washington insiders couldn't ignore, the confrontation had not only diminished him, but had elevated her into his domain. When asked about her rise, Marquez downplayed the confrontation. "It was one night," she told reporters. "What matters is what we do with the trust the public gives us." But her colleagues, even her rivals, recognized the truth. She had shifted the balance of power, a new political currency. Confrontation also redefined the unwritten rules of political communication. For decades, candidates and commentators alike had relied on charisma, sound bites, and sheer force of delivery to dominate exchanges. Harrington embodied this approach. Confident, dismissive, sharp-tongued, but Marquez flipped the script. Her power came not from raising her voice, but from lowering it, not from attacking, but from presenting. She demonstrated that, in an era of fact-checking and viral clips, the most effective weapon was often the simplest: proof. The phrase "bring receipts" became more than a meme. It became political currency. Strategists drilled it into candidates. Always anticipate. Always prepare. Always have the evidence. For some, it was liberating, a reminder that substance still had value. For others, it was terrifying, a recognition that a single overlooked fact could destroy a career. Debate prep changed. Campaign workshops added sections titled the Marquez Rule. Candidates rehearsed not only their talking points, but also how to withstand opponents armed with documentation. The culture of preparation intensified, reshaping the way campaigns operated. The broader public, for the American public, the confrontation resonated because it felt real. In a political climate saturated with noise, the sight of a lawmaker calmly presenting documents against a seasoned veteran struck a chord. It was satisfying not just for partisans, but for anyone who valued truth over theater. The phrase, "Don't Harrington," it spread beyond politics. Teachers used it, when reminding students to back up their claims in essays. Corporate managers invoked it before presentations. Even sports commentators joked about it when athletes underestimated their opponents. The moment became a metaphor for preparation, evidence, and accountability. And in a culture often defined by shortcuts, it carried weight. The legacy in Washington, the legacy was more complicated. Some saw Marquez's victory as proof that truth could still triumph. Others saw it as a reminder of how fragile reputations had become in the digital age. For Democrats, it was a rallying point. Marquez's breakthrough symbolized the power of young, diverse voices prepared to challenge the establishment. For Republicans, it was a warning. Underestimating opponents was no longer a survivable mistake. But beyond the partisan lines, the confrontation altered how lawmakers approached discourse. Grandstanding still existed, it always would, but the bar for preparation had risen. Lawmakers now feared the viral clip that could haunt them for years. Harrington versus Marquez. The contrast endures. The enduring image was one of contrast. Harrington, red-faced, defensive, caught off guard. Marquez, steady, factual, unflinching. One moment encapsulated two archetypes, the blusterer and the prepared, and while Harrington faded, Marquez ascended. Their paths diverged, yet remained linked, each defined by that hour-long segment. In the story of American politics, they were forever paired, not equals, but opposites. The lesson ultimately. The confrontation's legacy was not about one man's downfall or one woman's rise. It was about the enduring power of preparation. It reminded the public and politicians that truth still mattered, that facts could still shift narratives, that substance could still pierce through spectacle. In an era dominated by cynicism, that reminder carried weight. It was more than just a political skirmish. It was a demonstration of what political discourse could aspire to, informed, evidence-based, accountable, and in the years that followed, whether in classrooms, campaign offices, or boardrooms, the lesson echoed. Bring your facts, bring your truth, always bring the receipts.